I'm here to present the work that I've done along with Dr. Marcella Bonanomi on governing collaborative project delivery as a common pool resource scenario. I think it's a nice kind of move from Vedran's work here, and I'm going to present our conceptual model and the illustrations, a couple short illustrations from practice. I will say that in talking about collaborative project delivery, of course, we know there are many types, alliancing, partnering. A lot of my experiences and a lot of this conceptualization comes from my experience in North America with the project delivery type of integrated project delivery. And this is also often used for procurement of complex buildings, but not necessarily infrastructure. So these are a couple of important contexts to keep in mind. But when we look at the difference between these collaborative types of project delivery versus traditional project delivery models, I try to summarize it as having three distinct differences between the two. The first one is that especially with integrated project delivery, the multi-party contract creates a shared financial pool. And the literature often explains these as profit pools or common pools or contingency pools. The second is that the project creates a shared decision-making rights structure over the entire project direction. So this is an example from a project I worked on, a $2 billion hospital project in San Francisco, which I studied as part of my PhD. And here you have what they call the big room meeting. So they have multiple stakeholders from different companies delivering the project, all meeting together. And in theory, there's a pluralistic governance structure and enforced by the contract that allows everyone to have some say in the shared decision-making rights. And this is because there's a shared and reward that's given to the project's participants. In the case I just explained, there was 8 parties, but I've seen as many as 17 parties that will sign a single multi-party contract. And importantly, they are pooling the resources of the owner, and then they're saying within this pooled resources, we have agreements around profit pooling and incentives. And they also have others that are outside of the shared resource pool, and these are traditional contracts, dyadic contracts between parties. Okay, so this is the setting in which we find that integrated project delivery and other collaborative project delivery models exist. And what I found in my experience was that there was a problem, is that I felt that the IPD and the other collaborative project delivery literature has an overemphasis on practices and mechanisms. So a lot of the literature, especially in my domain, which is kind of management of engineering construction projects, looks at kind of, okay, here are the practices of IPD and here are the mechanisms. So we have a big room, we have a joint decision-making, we have shared risk and reward. And this is, I think, very useful. I don't want to say that practice-based approach doesn't have its place. But the trouble is that I didn't find that we had some type of overarching theory or conceptualization of what was really happening. We found that these projects were very successful, and there's a number of field reports showing their success, yet we don't really have a higher level conceptualization. So I was able to find that actually inspired a lot by the work of Nuno Gil, to thinking about these projects and conceptualizing their governance as a common pool resource scenario. Now, this picture is appropriate. I spent the last 5 years of my life living in Switzerland, and maybe you're familiar with the phrase, the tragedy of the commons. In this case, the pasture is open to all, and everyone receives the benefit for their own animals that might be herding the grass. But there's a delayed cost of deterioration. And then if you're rationally acting, in theory, then you would then be incentivized to add more animals, keep overgrazing until the overall ecosystem goes down. And from this starting point, I began to wonder, is it also true that we have, for example, the problem of a tragedy of a project, especially these collaborative projects? We've now, in theory and also contractually, opened up the budget and the schedule to all participants on the construction project, and they're going to receive a benefit because they're guaranteed to have direct cost reimbursements. But there could be a delayed cost if the project is kind of overall not performing, and then everyone will lose their profits that's then put at risk. And so you could have a downward spiral of project resources, or the tragedy of the project. Now, fortunately, if you're familiar with the tragedy of the commons, what you may not know is that actually the tragedy is kind of an imagined tragedy. There was a recent paper that called the tragedy of commons bullshit, excuse my language. But, essentially, if you read that paper, the conclusion is that you need then, therefore, a centralized entity to take control because the commoners are not able to kind of manage themselves. But then Elinor Ostrom came along and won the Nobel Prize by saying that no, actually local actors are the best in a decentralized approach to manage the commons. And she developed 8 design principles, which I do not have time to go through all of them, but I will mention quickly 2 of them, in which is the best way to manage a common pool resource scenario. And so what we do in our conceptual paper is we just highlight the connections between these two, right? So how are these practices that we find on these IPD projects related to the best principles of common pool resource governance for long enduring common pool resource scenarios? So for example, the first design principle is that we must clearly define the boundaries of the common pool resource. It actually goes against what Fedrin was just explaining about opening up, but they're kind of clearly saying that you are in on the project delivery team and you are out. And they do this also defining the boundaries of the resources. So they say how much budget and schedule time is available through a practice called the validation study. We just don't have time to get into it, but this is where the team co-defines everything. Now we had a theoretical approach. We wrote the conceptual paper, but at the same time, we also wanted to see how this would play out in practice. So Dr. Bonanomi spent several months visiting Canada, where she looked at the East Vancouver Integrated Health and Social Housing Project. It actually was the first integrated project delivery project in Canada that was delivered with a public client. She conducted 81 hours of observations and many interviews. I won't get into the details there, but I think this quote, really emphasizes the overall mindset of the participants as a collective community. A trade contractor, normally the lower end of the hierarchy, says it's great that we're at the table with everyone, the owners, the consultants, etc. There is no hierarchy anymore. Everyone is equally respected. There is, however, a lot of stress concerning the shared risk aspect. I'm used to putting myself and my company at risk, but not used to putting all the other groups involved at risk. And at the same time, it drives accountability. And what we've done is we've kind of looked at how specific practices that occur there are related to the best practices and design rules of common pool resources. I'll give another very short example here, the principle of monitoring. So Ostrom says that monitors should be present and actively be auditing the resource conditions. And those monitors should either be the users themselves, the participants, or they should be accountable to the user. So it's not a hierarchy that's monitoring, but it's coming from the bottom up. And we saw this here on the project, where we had a weekly review of each project team reporting a metric called the planned percent complete. What they had to do is they had to write it at the top of their board here. So they had to specifically say, here was the percent that we have completed. I think it's also interesting that this was actually a representative team of the owner. So again, you have the owner who's of the project, the sponsor, who is also accountable himself or herself to the rest of the users. And then you have a weekly meeting where everyone will report out and having a kind of social form of monitoring and then eventually maybe even sanctioning. So finally, I'll end with this. This allows to guide future project managers to design the governance practices of the future. Today, you kind of copy and paste from previous projects and you think about different practices and mechanisms. But if we can reframe our thinking to say that we need to design governance mechanisms that are enabling the common pool resource design principles, we can then now imagine future ideas. Future ways of governing our projects. And just as a short example, we are also doing a bit of work now on with blockchain about project delivery on the crypto commons, and we're using Ostrom's principles as some of our guiding principles to come up with these practices. So that's all for me. Thank you very much. These are the 3 papers which I've referred to, and very happy for your questions.